American soldiers, officers who did similar to what you did, had a transformation and think of an intellectual growth process to see the score and then converse with them? And second, have you thought about really doing a story about that?
I've thought about doing kind of a piece on where soldiers are now. I mean, they're running for Congress, they're writing books, they have radio shows, they're kind of all over the place now. People have come back, and it's a voice of a generation. And a lot of them have problems with what they did over there. The guy you're talking about, I think, is Mark Longorius, and he has a book called Fear Up Harsh, and he was an interrogator at Abu Ghraib. He was actually on Al Jazeera today, is how I know. I watched him on the Riz Khan show get interviewed. I do cross paths with those kind of guys. We're not quite as organized as one might think. There are some organizations, but the truth is I've tried to avoid it a bit. In 2004, when I came out, it was right in the middle of the election, right before the election, and there was a lot of pressure to come out politically for a candidate, and then there's been a lot of pressure to come out against the war, to come out against this or against that, and I've really tried to maintain. I saw something firsthand, and what I saw was Central Command operations, which are supposed to be kind of an honest broker, public affairs officer, was supposed to be an honest broker of the truth, was used in a very political way before the war. What happened was, at Central Command, there's a public affairs office, and there's a colonel who runs that office. He has to go through an interview process at the time with Tommy Franks. This colonel was named Ray Shepard, and he was in charge of this office, and he had been doing media liaisons since 1975 for the Air Force. Now, if you ask a public affairs officer before the invasion, why are you going to invade Iraq? The only honest answer he can give you is, we'll invade if the president orders us to, and we won't if he doesn't. So the military doesn't get to pick and choose their battles. They do what they're ordered to do, and they don't do the other ones. What a public affairs officer is supposed to speak about is the conduct of that action. But that's not what happened. What happened was, a couple of months before the war, a Republican operative named Jim Wilkinson, straight out of the White House from Texas, he was 32 years old, was put in charge of my office, displacing that colonel who had been doing media liaison since Jim was 3. Jim wore a uniform without rank. He walked around like kind of an information paramilitary type guy, but he had the equivalent rank of a 2-star general. And what Jim knew how to do, he used to work for Dick Armey. He was on the 2000 Bush election. He was in charge of the media in South Florida at the end of the election. Jim knew how to run a campaign. And that's how he ran our media office. So, here's the deal. If I'm going to go out and do an interview on the American Press, and I'm a young officer in uniform, and we're at Central Command in 2003, mind you, let's say it's on MSNBC, what you would see is the reporter interviewing me, and then you would see how they package that coverage. And what MSNBC packaged their coverage with in spring of 2003 is, our hearts are with you, a banner, you being guys like me, the troops. So do you think the reporter can ask me a critical question? No way. There'd be such a backlash from his editorial management, much less his audience, of why the reporter is grilling a young guy in uniform at the war right before the invasion. He would never do it. So what the reporter would do is say, are there any messages you want to get across today before we do the interview? Well, I've just come from the meeting with the White House guy who says these are the messages you're going to get across today. Weapons of mass destruction, ties to terrorism, regime change. So I go out and he asks me that and say, yeah, sure, weapons of mass destruction, ties to terrorism, regime change, great. Here are the questions I'll ask you. And he sets up the questions to get out the White House messages of the day on the news. So you have a young officer in uniform giving the reasons that we're going to invade a sovereign nation without a challenging question, in an atmosphere that can't be challenged. Now that was devised, that was planned, that wasn't by accident, that was absolutely intentional. And that's what I not only witnessed, but actually did firsthand. Now, I stay away from like joining with all the other guys because sometimes I feel like if I come out about a number of other issues, even issues about the Iraq War, I mean, honestly, what do I know about Abu Ghraib? I wasn't there, I didn't witness it. I feel like it dilutes the fact that I'm a first-hand witness to something that we did really, really wrong. The next thing you know, I'm down praising Hugo Chavez's glorious revolution in Venezuela. What do I really know about that? So rather than kind of joining together in a larger political thing, I've tried to stay really specific. And it took me a while to learn that. When you have a microphone, you have a different responsibility than when you're in the pub offering your opinions on a lot of things. But no one essentially can argue with what I saw and what I did and why that's wrong. So I stick to my guns on that. Yeah, in the back there.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for what you're doing. Franklin said we've got a republic if we can keep it. And we've endured the McCarthy hearings, cases against us, and Iran-Contra, in part because of people like you. And you
I'm
spoke
sorry, sir. I actually can't hear you. Can you hold the mic just a little closer?
Okay. Is this better?
Yeah. Sorry, too many years in the military.
I was just saying that we've endured all kinds of witch hunts because of people like you. You spoke just a moment ago about Jim Wilkinson. I heard your interview with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Could you speak a little bit about his participation in the Brooks Brothers riot?
Yeah, sure. Jim, the guy who was my boss at Central Command, in charge of the information operations for the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, everything under Central Command when he was the communications czar there. He used to work on the Hill with Dick Armey. Matter of fact, he's the one that came up with, Gore said that he invented the internet. Jim was the one who disseminated that to the media. Then in the 2000 election with Bush, he was involved in handling the media at the recount in South Florida. And here's what happens. Dade County Canvassing Board is going to recount the ballots. The Republicans don't want them to, because the Republicans want to wait for the Florida Supreme Court to come out with a decision on whether they could recount the ballots or not. So what happens is there's a riot at the canvassing office. It's stormed by a bunch of people who are upset about the process. It becomes unsafe for the people who are going to count the votes, and they have to shut down the canvassing office. Meanwhile, the Florida Supreme Court comes out with a decision that they can't recount the ballots. When you go back and look at the pictures of who stormed the office, it's now called the Brooks Brothers riot because they're all young, they're Natalie attired, they're blonde haired, and you can start circling faces and identifying them. They're congressional staffers from D.C., all Republican. If they were moved from here to there, and that was a coordinated planned event, is crossing state lines and intimidating the voting process, which is a federal crime. So Jim came out in the media and said it was just an emotional moment. A bunch of good Americans felt like the voting process was being swept away from them and they lost control. So you can go back and you can, if you Google Brooks Brothers riot, the spokesperson for the Republicans that explains it away is Jim Wilkinson. He gets promoted from that into the new White House, part of their Office of Global Communications. He pops up again on September 14th, 2001. President Bush visits Ground Zero. President Bush gets handed a megaphone and he says to the workers, I hear you and soon the rest of the world will hear you. It's a huge media event for the Bush administration of him taking control after September 11th. It's an event that is orchestrated by Jim Wilkinson. From there, he goes to become a charter member of a group called the White House Iraq Group, WIG, W-H-I-G. In this group are Jim, Condoleezza, I. Scooter Libby, Andrew Card, and about 3 others. And they're brought together in the summer of 2002 to decide how to sell the war to the American people. They're questioned about it by the media, and Andy Card's famous quote is, "You don't release a new product in August," meaning that they wanted to hold on to their plan until a little bit later. It was marketing. Jim goes, everyone in that meeting, by the way, is later subpoenaed as part of the Valerie Plame case. Jim goes from the White House Iraq Group to putting on a uniform with a 2-star equivalent rank and becoming my boss in the information czar at Central Command and selling the war in Iraq. So that's the backstory on Jim. Today, he is the Chief of Staff for Henry Paulson, the Secretary of Treasury.